Is Fischl broken now? This might sound like a very weird question to all the people that already thought she was at the very top of the chain before the new set even came out, but to me it was never quite like that. She was always very strong, but never too unbalanced. Just objectively speaking, and please have faith that I can somewhat speak objectively, as of late Fischl was predominantly used on Quicken teams. In particular, she worked best on double electro Quicken teams, where she could dish out mind-boggling single target damage with her Ascension 4 passive enabled. Also, she could function as a very reliable battery for the likes of Cyno and Yae, so the energy-starving electro units. Still, what about her other teams though? They kinda got overshadowed by just how strong her Quicken comps was, and also by the fact the meta kinda changed as a whole. In fact, while you can still use her with a good old Bennett and Kazuha duo, or even on teams where she doesn't get particular buffs, her damage just falls off compared to Quicken teams, as she basically loses all of her Ascension 4 passive damage, and she can only cast odds once per rotation. The reason is that while on Quicken teams her damage is high enough that it's worth to shape the entire team rotation so she can cast odds twice, this is not the case for her other teams. Now, after this premise, let's see how her status changed with the new artifact set she got, the Golden Troupe, which I talked about in the video I made yesterday. Make sure you go see it. As I stated yesterday, she gets a tremendous 17% damage increase from that over mixed options like Thundering Fury and Gladiator. I will spare you a full guide here though, so I won't talk about things like what her skill does, what her passives do, how good her constellations are, because at this point I kind of think everybody knows what she can do at a basic level, so let's jump to the juicy calculation right away. First and foremost, something I got asked a lot about her is how her weapon selection changed after she got a set that modified their stat structure drastically. Specifically, the new Golden Troupe set increased their damage bonus by a lot, so people were wondering what this means for Stringless, a weapon that primarily increases that stat as well. The answer is that not much changes on Quicken teams, but there is still a slight variation in favor of weapons that don't lead to stat saturation. In fact, while Stringless is still a very strong option and the clear-cut best 4-star weapon for Fischl, the difference between it and a crit rate weapon like Viridis and Veneer decreased by 3%. In general, this gives more value to many of the 5-star options on Fischl, who largely buff other stats rather than damage bonus, or at least don't buff it as much as Stringless, which is the case for Aqua and Hunter's Path. On teams other than Quicken, Stringless just fares much worse, because the elemental mastery stat buff it provides is almost completely wasted, and while it's even weaker than before now that she has this set, there was always a large difference between that and 5-star options for Fischl in such roles, so it's not exactly shocking to see a gap that wide now. Another question you might have is how things vary for Fischl in terms of artifacts builds. Specifically, does the damage bonus goblet become redundant if you have Stringless? The answer is no, unless you use her without Bennett on non-Quicken teams, in which case attack and damage bonus goblet are rather even. Still, this last case is a scenario where generally your Fischl won't be dealing much of the team damage, so no reason to overly stress it. Having said all of this nerdy stuff, let's actually move on to the slightly more interesting nerdy stuff, namely how good her damage profile is now. For the most part, I would say that the new set is a large enough increase for Fischl that it's a quite significant difference in single target scenarios, on a team-wide scale even. For example, while Fischl has always been vaguely better than Yae in single target scenarios, this set takes the gap to a whole new level, even counting both with their best 5-star weapons, so Kagura for Yae and Aqua for Fischl, a scenario that favors Yae since she gets a bigger buff from that from the best 4-star option than Fischl does. Fischl completely swallows Yae in single target scenarios. The difference is so big that even if Fischl used some of her weaker damage options like Elegy, she would still compete rather evenly in single target with Yae. However, single target is not all there is to it, and this is something people often ignore when they call Fischl broken in terms of damage. While it's hard to predict the exact accuracy of AoE hits, it's possible to make assumptions to see how well the damage will scale up in each scenario. In Yae's case, If there are multiple enemies around, her elemental skill will generate more aggravate procs, as hitting multiple targets would allow it to partially circumvent its standard internal cooldown rule. More importantly, Yae's burst nuke becomes an incredibly relevant source of damage in AoE scenarios, while Fischl's AoE hits generally just consist of her odd summon button, which is not very relevant. The result? Against 3 enemies, a count that is pretty realistic for Abyss scenarios, assuming Yae's burst hits everybody, which is not that rare if you group opponents with a character like Kazuha, she'll comfortably end up surpassing Fischl in terms of rotation damage. Still, single target dominance shouldn't just get slammed like this, as it's the best way to deal with bosses and groups of enemies that are hard to gather in one spot in general. For this reason, it's interesting to see just how good Fischl is at what she does best. To contextualize this, I tried to compare her to another off-field single-target juggernaut, Yelan. Specifically, since it wouldn't be fair to consider just a relatively harmless Favonius version of Yelan, I tried to make a comparison for them both at their highest and at their lowest. Specifically, the first comparison includes a Quicken Fischl and a Monohydro Yelan, both holding Aqua Simulacra. In this context, Yelan doesn't have extensive energy recharge issues, so she can hold Aqua pretty decently, and that makes her damage skyrocket. Still, impressively, Fischl just detonates her in terms of damage per second. The other scenario is more even. Fischl is quite unimpressive in non-Quicken teams, as I said earlier, as she gets stripped of her powerful Ascension 4 procs, and she's only able to cast odds once a rotation in most cases. Yelan is also nerfed here, since she doesn't get the same energy benefits she gets on other teams, which makes it much harder for her to use Aqua at Constellation 0. As a result, in a 4-star weapons showdown where Fischl is holding Stringless and Yelan is holding Favonius, they're rather even. Overall though, I just want to highlight how impressive it is for Fischl to beat a Constellation 0 Aqua Yelan so convincingly in the first scenario, and it's something that in my opinion makes her the absolute queen of single target off-field damage dealing, if you're considering all 5 stars in the game at Constellation 0. So, is Fischl broken now? While I don't think this damage increase is quite enough for her to be comparable to characters like Kazuha, I definitely think her boss killing output is reaching a point where it's bordering on unbalanced. While this might not be enough to make her best character in the game tier, it definitely puts her in a tier of her own for an aspect that is always going to be relevant in the game, and this is just amazing for a character that is so easily accessible to people. I'm done for today. As always, if you enjoyed the video, make sure to leave a thumbs up, a comment and subscribe. See you next time!